Welcome to the TMBS live stream. We are live with our Canadian comrade, David Doel. He's the host of the Rational National. For whatever reason you haven't subscribed over there yet, go do that as soon as this is over. David,
that's right.
How you doing?
I'm awesome, Michael. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. It's great to be speaking with you. This has been a long time coming.
Yep, it has.
So you're going to tell us about Canadian politics tonight. I guess
I am.
The first question I have for you, David, and no offense, is there... No, I'm just kidding. I feel like you know what's funny is we've gotten this reputation of not doing Canada coverage, but we've actually done a decent amount. We even did an illicit history of Canadian politics with Luke Savage, who's a great journalist there.
I heard that. That was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and by the way, it turns out that you guys aren't as nice and fluffy as you have the brand.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I also get shit for not doing enough Canadian politics. And
well, right. Because I'm sorry to break balls, but you have an interesting channel. So how much Canadian politics? Shots fired.
The thing is, like, yeah, I'm Canadian. Sure, I ran as a Green Party candidate in 2015. But that doesn't mean that I need to be, stuck to just one country. And, here's the reality. For me, America is so fucked up right now that it's tough for me to focus on Canadian politics. And look, we have our issues, of course, in Canada, but America has some serious problems. So it's always, American politics has always been more alluring to me than Canadian politics has. That said, I do think it's important to touch on these issues now and then, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, of course. And we actually will, all kidding aside, we've got another program planned as we move forward closer to these Canadian elections that they might be in the fall, in October.
Yeah, so the election hasn't been called yet, but very likely it'll be October 21st is when election day will be. So, I mean, right now it's not looking too great for left politics in Canada. So we currently have a liberal majority, obviously through the Trudeau government, but it's a liberal majority that answers to a conservative opposition. And the way the way the polls are looking right now, it appears as though we're going to end up with a minority government, either a liberal minority or a conservative minority, which actually, I mean, in the case of a liberal minority, it would actually be beneficial for the left, more so in that scenario than it would be for a liberal majority again, because we would actually have more of a say through the NDP and the Greens. And there's also the potential that there could be a coalition. Now, Canada historically has not been too big on coalition governments. But having said that, if we're in a situation where the Conservatives win a minority, then there is a good potential there that Trudeau will try to strike a deal with the NDP and potentially the Greens as well to try and form government. So
before so let's move it. Actually, I mean, not before. Let's move it backwards a little bit, and
Sure.
I want to talk about the main parties. I want to talk about whether or not there's a right wing. That's because I mean, part of the reason. Look, one, it's obviously Canada's next to a superpower whose reach hits every part of the globe, obviously, and then I think the other thing is like. And, with our politics, this is obviously not a compliment by any stretch of the imagination, but it's like, in addition, you have like an Obama-style government while the United States, your superpower neighbor, is, kind of doing full-on clown fascism with concentration camps. But that being said, I mean, and then I want to talk about the main parties. I want to talk about the right, and then I want to see if there's like any kind of activists sort of grassroots perspective that's worth touching on, separate from electoral politics as well. But sure. I guess before we get to all of that, I mean, briefly, like, I have an extremely negative impression of Justin Trudeau, and is he as bad as people like me would think?
I mean, yes and no. And it's so hard. I mean, me as somebody who covers American politics so much and is always seeing what Trump's putting out there, it's hard for me to have the perspective that Trudeau is as terrible in this time, simply because of what we see going on in other countries. Now, that said, I think you made the correct comparison there, comparing Trudeau to Obama, because that's the fear here. Is Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party is very much a centrist, center-right kind of party, and it doesn't help that you have the Conservatives in the opposition pulling them in that direction. And that kind of scenario, I mean, in the U.S., it led to right-wing populism. Luckily, here we don't necessarily have that risk here, simply because the one party that may kind of represent a Trump-style politics is the People's Party of Canada, with the leader Maxime Bernier, and there's just no hope for that party to form any sort of power. But that said, I mean, the Conservative Party in Canada, I mean, we had 10 years of a Conservative government in Canada before Trudeau came in. And that shift, I mean, I remember back in 2015 when Trudeau won, we were actually, I felt happy. I was excited.
Well,
because
Stephen Harper was a hard right government, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was even getting to the point where the Conservative government was muzzling scientists. Yeah. So scientists had to essentially go through all these checks in order to actually respond to questions from the press.
That's crazy. We'd never do anything like that here.
Well, exactly. Right. But it was getting to that point. And so when Trudeau came into power, there was sort of this hope in the air that things were going to change. And in some ways, it kind of did. I mean, it went back to a status quo that was at least more palatable for a lot of people on the left. But then we go into, I mean, the list of broken promises is just, I mean, whether it's on fossil fuels and continuing to issue fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, the Trudeau government promised to end fossil fuel subsidies, really take a real solid position on climate change. They never really did, and they ended up buying a $4.5 billion pipeline from Kinder Morgan, which they plan to expand. There's also the broken promise on electoral reform. So electoral reform, there was this, I mean, Trudeau campaigned on this day in, day out, on how this will be the last election where we have a first-past-the-post system. And then because, I mean, I have to assume because they won a majority government on this first-past-the-post system, they completely broke that promise on electoral reform. And we continue to have a system where the Trudeau government formed a majority government with 40% of the vote. And most majority governments are formed with less than half of the vote. And to me, that doesn't make any sense. So when we're looking, I mean, going forward, this is part of the reason why, again, a minority government is actually hopeful for us, because the NDP and the Greens would have more of a say in a minority government than in a majority government. So when you have a majority Liberal government, there is very little say from the actual left. Meanwhile, the Liberal Party gets to pretend to be the left in the country when they simply aren't.
And Trudeau, and I know, like, on foreign policy, I mean, there's been arms sales to the Saudis, though he obviously pissed the Saudis off, but he still sold weapons to them. Yep. I know that, Krista Freeland, the foreign minister, was quite eager to meet with Bolsonaro, and the same dynamics in Brazil that are with U.S. corporate interests apply to Canada as well, and, in Venezuela, and the same kind of general. Canada has a very underappreciated role in exploiting the Caribbean, so nothing good there. And I'm assuming on sort of like, has he bumped funding for the health service or anything like that? I mean, that's just been sort of like not great, but not taking cuts to it?
Yeah, it's sort of just kind of, again, it's been status quo. So
got it.
In this country, we don't have a universal pharmacare system or dental care for that matter. And this is something that the NDP is now going to run on, and the Liberals will try to. So they're sort of going to be a half measure in terms of their position on pharmacare. It sounds like it'll be sort of semi-universal in a way. We're going to have to see how they roll that out. But it's these half measures, and it's sort of what, I mean, I liken it to the Democratic Party as it currently stands in America, where they are treated as though they are, the left, as though they are actually listening to, workers, whether it's labor rights or what have you, but they don't. And I mean, another example of this was the SNC-Lavalin scandal, where you have this massive Quebec-based multinational that were up on fraud and corruption charges, and the AG in Trudeau's cabinet, Jody Wilson-Raybould, was pushing to prosecute them, but Trudeau, it eventually came out, Trudeau's office was pushing for a deferred prosecution agreement, which essentially would let them off with a slap on the wrist. And this is again showing you, and this is a company that's given the Liberal Party thousands in donations, has had a very close relationship with the Liberals. So again, it's this sort of this public facing, oh, we're with the people, but then behind the scenes, what's actually happening is this is just like your typical neoliberal party. And yeah.
And so just briefly, when it comes to the Conservatives, you said that the actual main Conservative opposition is not running a Trump-style campaign. Then you have, what did you call it? The popular, what is it? The
People's Party of Canada.
The People's Party of Canada, which, by the way, Matt tells me is another former Dave Rubin guest. So I can only imagine how horrible that person is. But what about so maybe elaborate on like the Andrew Scheer, I think his name is. But what about the Ford faction? Isn't that the Progressive Conservative Party? And are they only powerful in like a specific state or province?
So Doug Ford and his PC party, the Progressive Conservative Party, they hold power in Ontario. So Doug Ford essentially, I guess in American terms, is like a governor of Ontario. So that's where the PCs currently hold power. And yeah, I mean, Doug Ford is sort of the I guess potential extreme to where Andrew Scheer could potentially end up if he were to somehow form government. And we're talking, I mean, cuts to public services, cuts to healthcare, cuts to autism, labor, pulling back labor reforms. I mean, we were going to have a raise in the minimum wage here, as well as 2 extra sick days in Ontario. And Doug Ford rolled that back. I mean, that was on the books. It was going to happen, and he stopped it from happening, while at the same time also giving a tax break to the wealthiest people in Ontario. And again, this is a guy who ran on a campaign of "For the People." That was his slogan, "For the People." So Doug Ford very much in some ways is kind of like a Donald Trump type figure. He's also attached himself to Donald Trump. He's complimented Donald Trump in the past. I mean, this is a guy he's so toxic now that he's actually taking extra time off in the fall so that he won't have to be viewed as an appendage of the Conservative Party.
So his polls are plummeting because he's been so bad. But what about like, and Andrew Scheer, the main Conservative Party, I guess from what I've read, it seems like he's actually kind of saying like, he seems like he's almost taking more of a track of like David Cameron back in like 2009 or in 2008 when he was initially taking on Labour in the UK and kind of saying like, well, I'm not necessarily like, we're going to do some things about the environment, but they'll just be slower and, you know, and so on and so on, kind of almost seeming to like sort of brand himself as a moderate, which is, you know, obviously there's little political space if he's doing that, considering that that Justin Trudeau's Liberals are so far to the right anyways. But what about that in the context of the fact that, you know, there's really, just like in the United States, and it seems, and some of it are like the exports from Canada, that there is a very hard, extreme, xenophobic far right in Canada as well. Like, how does that fit into the election?
So Scheer is trying to play both sides. Okay. So he's trying to play that moderate voice, but at the same time, he's also engaging in sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric, but less in your face than Maxime Bernier. I mean, Maxime Bernier, if you go through that guy's Twitter account, there's transphobia, comments about refugees, immigrants.
Ideas.
Yeah, ideas, exactly.
A lot of ideas.
I mean, this is a guy who was almost, he came so close to becoming the conservative leader of the Conservative Party, that, I mean, at the time, he appeared to be more like a libertarian type-ish candidate for the conservative leadership, and wasn't engaging in that sort of rhetoric. But then after he left the conservative party to form his own party, I think he's recognized this rising xenophobia, and he's trying to attach himself to that, which potentially um, may peel some votes off from the Conservative Party. We haven't seen it yet in the polling. I mean, the People's Party is polling down around like 1%. So it's not clear yet if once the actual campaigning starts, if he's going to be able to peel away some of those votes. I think he will. I think once he gets on TV a lot more, he's going to get a lot more attention and be able to get some of those votes. I mean, just to go on Maxime Bernier for a second, he was just pictured with a members of I think it's the Northern, I forget their exact name, but they're members of the Soldiers of Odin.
Seriously,
far right hate group. Yeah, so
he did
these people.
Okay, right.
Yeah, so I mean, these are people that are showing up to his rallies. So I mean, this is why people dub his party the White People's Party and not just the People's Party of Canada, because that's what he represents. He represents this hatred, this faction of hateful white people, and he's trying to ride on that. And while Scheer has been vocally against that in some instances.
We have a photo up here. This is Maxime Bernier, photographed with members of an alleged hate group in Calgary. And of course, we would say they are a hate group. They're actually, one of them is throwing up the OK sign.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what that is. I'm always told Beverly Hills, Eddie Murphy threw that in Beverly Hills Cop, so it can't be white supremacist because he did that in the 1980s. I get it, guys. It's very clever. All right, go ahead.
So those are members of the Northern Guard. So it's an offshoot of the Soldiers of Odin hate group. So I mean, this is who he's. I mean, going for that vote in a more obvious way, whereas Andrew Scheer is trying to downplay it and be a little more careful with his language.
He's
around
Mitt Romneying it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, I don't really understand his supporters. I don't, because the Liberal Party is essentially what the Conservative Party should be, and the People's Party of Canada is where all that hatred is. So the Conservative Party is it's sort of a party for a lot of people as the vote where, if they want change, say you're a Liberal voter and you don't really pay too close attention to politics, but you don't like Trudeau, you may vote for Andrew Scheer's Conservatives because they're the official opposition. They have the greatest potential to form government apart from the Liberal Party, and it means change in some way. So I think that's where a lot of his vote comes from, just people that are really not as engaged in politics right now. Because otherwise, I mean, in terms of ideology, I don't really understand where they fit.
What about the NDP and Jagmeet Singh? My understanding is that that's the social democratic alternative.
Yep.
I guess his leadership. I actually just had a patron actually send me a copy of his book, which I actually read. Believe it or not, so I should be getting a lot of Canadian politics cred.
Yeah.
But it's a very I've had my life. I've had some people that have been very close to me in the not in Canadian, but the American Sikh community who had been from the Punjab, and that's where his background is. He has a pretty compelling life story. I mean, there's some parts in the book that are, there's a little bit like my sort of radar of like a kind of self-serving political autobiography is obviously there, but there's a lot of things that seem really appealing about him as a leader. The NDP is, I mean, my understanding is that they're really a bold plan on pharmaceutical care.
Yep.
Why are they not catching fire, or are they actually doing well? Like, what's going on with them?
Well, simply basing this off the way the polling looks right now, they're sort of in the mid-teens, whereas you have the Liberals and the Conservatives sort of switching top spots around 33-35%. So yeah, a large part of the reason why they haven't really caught on, at least yet, I mean, there is the potential that, again, once the campaigns actually start, that once these leaders are seen on TV more often, there'll be some shifts in how people intend to vote. But is simply the fact that because we have a system where sure we have multiple parties, but you still have an opposition party and a party that leads. The focus when it comes to news is simply on the liberals and the conservatives, and a lot of people just aren't aware of what Jagmeet Singh is about, aren't aware of what the NDP plans to do. And even though, I mean, everyone knows that the NDP exists, but because they don't have the exposure in media as much as the other two parties, I think that's hurt them. I also think there is sort of a strain. I mean, Jagmeet Singh is the first visible minority leader of a major party in Canada. I think there is a strain of people that just aren't used to that, and to them that they don't understand it, and that's also going to hurt Jagmeet Singh's potential to grab some attention. But I think once the campaigning starts, he's going to be able to get over a lot of that those unknowns where people aren't quite sure what Jagmeet Singh and the NDP is about. I mean, this is a party that's based in labor rights. I mean, based in the labor movement, based in democratic socialism. You have Tommy Douglas was the first leader of the NDP. He's the father of universal health care. Tommy Douglas was voted the greatest Canadian of all time during this massive national event in the early 2000s. So you have a lot of history there with the NDP and labor rights and healthcare that I think the potential here for Jagmeet Singh is there to sort of bring that back and really become a true left party. Because in 2015, Tom Mulcair, the former leader of the NDP, he in some ways, at least rhetorically, was campaigning more to the right of Justin Trudeau. So he was campaigning on balanced budgets as opposed to Trudeau, who was campaigning on deficit spending. So you have Jagmeet Singh now, I think, potentially willing to kind of invigorate that left, be with universal pharmacare, affordable housing, labor reforms, like making it easier to join a union, banning the use of replacement workers in labor disputes, having a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour. So you have all of these potential policies here, a fair tax system, including a 1% wealth tax on wealth over 20 million. So there is the potential here to finally give the left voters a true choice in this election. And my hope is, I mean, part of the sell here has to be that the NDP can't necessarily play to the expectation that they are going to win. I mean, the way it looks right now, there is, unless things completely shift around, there is almost a zero. I mean, a very small chance that the NDP will be the party that ends up with the most seats here. But what they can play to is the potential for a coalition government, or for working with another party, say the Liberal Party, and being the left voice in that scenario, and having more power in that scenario where you have a potential coalition government, or a government where you have a Liberal minority but propped up by the NDP and the Greens, and having the Liberals answer to a left wing as opposed to answering always to Conservatives.
I have I want to get to a kind of structural question about that. We have a few minutes left, but I mean, first then let's get to the Greens. That's the last part I want to ask you about. And I just a quick two-part question. So I know you were a candidate for the Greens. I'm not sure where you are now in terms of, who you're leaning towards in this election. I've studied the Greens a little bit globally, and what's funny is, in the United States, I mean, I have a lot of criticisms of the Greens' electoral project. I just don't. I mean, it's just not set up for that in the United States, and for whatever reason, there hasn't been. There was actually more success in the Green parties locally in the United States like a decade ago. There was actually a guy elected, I think, to the state legislature in Maine as an example. There was a better performance then. So that's kind of one thing. In Europe, where the Greens have gained power, and where in some places they're, like in Germany, they're arguably ascendant. I mean, they certainly were the kind of main alternative vote getter to the right in the last European parliamentary elections. That they have sort of pivoted from more of a sort of like eco, almost like, I mean, the origins in Germany, as far as I understand, was like this kind of anti-politics party with a kind of there was a strong anarchist flavor to it, a lot of kind of
Mm,
anti-authority and institution of all kinds. Then there was certainly a conservatism, which I think we always have to sort of be aware of with eco-romanticism and the conservative, even fascist kind of
hmm
zone of that, particularly in Europe. But now, I mean, a lot of green parties in Europe are kind of centrist forces. They're the sort of like, you know, more analogous to like the Democratic Party or the Liberal Democrats. Obviously, they still are certainly better on green and the environment, which is really important. But it's definitely
hmm
usually a green capitalism. It's not friendly to labor. It's kind of upper middle class urbanite voting, which is, and even in other areas, they've been willing to actually indulge in xenophobia. So in
mm,
Canada, I mean, I know obviously the Greens are going to have a serious left contingent if you were a candidate for them. But
hmm
this is the second part of my question. Apparently, they're polling better than they've ever had before. And as part of being a serious presence, they've gotten themselves a serious political consultant who's
Yeah.
very controversial. What's going on? Who are they? What are they about?
Yeah. So in 2015, the Green Party was viewed as, I would say, the far left party. That's when I ran, and it does seem now with this new hire. So they just hired Warren Kinsella. He's a high profile political strategist. He's a self-proclaimed. This is what he calls himself, the Prince of Darkness of Canadian politics. And he leans center right. I mean, this guy donated to Doug Ford, donated over $1,000 to Doug Ford just a few months ago.
Hmm.
Doug Ford, and now he's going to be I mean, a part of the Green Party here and their strategy for this election. So, I mean, this is I'm very curious to see what the Green Party does this election cycle because now that they have this hire, I mean, this is a guy who he worked with Jean Chrétien's Liberals in the 90s, sort of the 90s era centrism and austerity.
Mhm.
He criticized the coalition government of the BC NDP and Greens. He even actually, in 2016, the Green Party passed a BDS resolution. And at that time, Kinsella wrote a piece urging Elizabeth May, the Green Party leader, to quit the Green Party leadership and call BDS activists, or he called BDS activists, lunatics, bigots, and conspiracy theorists.
Okay.
So, like, it's hard to place the guy. I mean, this is a guy who's clearly center right.
Well, has
Um,
he said anything since being hired? Like, hey, I have a different kind of politics that none of you even knew about, or like, has he said anything?
he has complimented Elizabeth May. Pretty much all he said so far, I mean, officially, is that he met with May and he was very impressed with her.
Hmm.
So, I mean, the thing is too. I mean, it's not like this is completely new territory for him. He worked with Olivia Chow in her mayoral campaign in Toronto. She's an NDP and actually the wife of Jack Layton, the former NDP leader who since has passed away. So I mean, he's worked, I guess, in a sense, with the left in that case, but he was eventually fired from that campaign. Anytime, I mean, it appears anywhere he goes since the Jean Chrétien days, he sort of leaves and just leaves a trail of garbage behind him, and
Hmm.
it doesn't. He never really appears to have a good impression on the people that he works with. So it's weird to hire someone like this, especially when you have the Green Party, as you said, rising in popularity. And the assumption is, I mean, at least part of it is that people have recognized that Elizabeth May, who's been the longest standing party leader in Canada up to this point, that she's a solid leader, and they have a solid platform that especially when it comes to climate change, and that there is the potential there to have a real voice in Parliament pushing for real climate change legislation. And I'm not quite sure what they think Warren Kinsella is gonna add to the whole discussion. I mean,
Do you
the
think
the
that they
idea is
have
that
a
he'll
sort
be
of? No, I'm sorry.
sorry,
Go
go ahead.
ahead.
The idea is that he'll be the defense for Elizabeth May. So
Hmm.
that is apparently their intention for hiring him, is that now that she's rising in popularity, that the party is rising in popularity, he'll sort of be there as for defense tactics as opposed to going on the offensive. We're going to have to wait and see if that's actually the case, but that appears to be why, at least publicly, why they say they hired him. So it's not, I mean, I'm not quite clear on where the Green Party is going to go from this point.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that sounds about right. And it's that dialectic of needing to professionalize, but then also like keep the purpose of why you're doing what you're doing. And in his case, I don't know anything about him, but it just seems to me from talking to you and looking into it a little bit that it's like he's bored.
Yeah.
Like wants to be in the game somehow.
No, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the guy that plays the game. He plays
Yeah.
the game, and this is part of his game.
And by the way, nicknaming yourself Prince of Darkness is lame as fuck. The final question I have for you. So
Yeah.
sometimes on this show, we've covered really important things like First Nations activism in Canada. One of the things that's really distinct, definitely about what Bernie Sanders is doing, is that it really is a campaign that is serving a sort of dual function as a presidential campaign and as a movement. Obviously, a really similar dynamic with Corbyn and Labor. And I think, and another reason actually that I focus on Brazil so much is I actually think that there is, at least in the inception of the Workers' Party and also PASAL to a certain extent, there is a huge organic connection between things like the landless workers movement. And so that we could see that like the kind of generation of traditional and left-wing projects or social democratic projects that are trying to renew themselves in today's world is that connection, that sort of organic connection in and outside of electoral politics. And when you go back to 2015 and you talk about how the then leader of the NDP was kind of moving somewhat to, moving to the kind of austerity wing on economics, you see the Green Party dealing with the dynamics of rising in power. It does go to those kind of questions. I think dismissing electoral politics is absurd, but I also do want to have enough of a kind of big picture vision that we can see like, well, you're playing in, if you have a left project, you're playing in a limited capitalist terrain. And it seems to be the only way to kind of shift that is activism, is strikes, is a bigger context. So, what do you think the prospects for that kind of energy, like a Jagmeet Singh as an example, do you think he's someone who can conceive of not just moving NDP to the left, but connecting it with movements that are arising? And are those movements there in Canada?
See, that's the issue. So that's part of the reason why I just don't see the NDP being in any sort of power position at the end of this election. There is no real solid vocal left movement in Canada right now. And I'm not sure what that's the function of. I mean, it could simply be because life isn't horrible for a lot of people in Canada. I don't want to say that, Canada's, we're not perfect. We have issues, of course, but we have universal health care that's relatively solid depending on your province. We have a situation where, after 2008, we didn't quite experience the crash that Americans and most of the world did. And it just, we haven't really felt the I guess that class conflict that really you can see in America. I mean, whenever I visit the US, the amount of poverty that I see is just not what I experience in Canada. Now, of course, look, there's going to be parts of Canada that are going to appear that way, or at least in some sense represent that sort of poverty that I see in America, but it's just not close. And I think that's part of the problem, is unless there is some a real fervor there for the rise of the left and that sort of movement towards left-wing politics and a more embracing class conflict and really ensuring that the wealthy pay their fair share, and that we want to move towards more solid climate policy and universal pharmacare and universal dental care, and really move in a direction that focuses on people over the powerful and the wealthy. Until we see that activist movement, I don't quite see a left-wing party coming to power, because we don't have that yet. And this is a discussion I had with Christo Avalis on my show. You should have him on your show as well, actually. He's a part of the NDP, and he's brilliant guy, historian,
Yes. We will
and
be having. When I said a second thing, I haven't planned it yet, but I will do something with him in the coming months as well.
yeah, he's great. So
Yep.
yeah, we had this discussion too, and he's more engaged in labor rights and labor movements, and he sort of agrees with me that we don't quite have that here yet. Now, that's not to say it's not going to rise, and we're not going to start seeing it, but because we don't have that massive activist, that loud left flank, I don't quite see the NDP or any solidly left party coming to power in Canada.
Who are you leaning towards supporting this time?
It's gonna likely NDP. I mean, it's gonna depend completely on the riding. And so,
Right.
and this is what I tell everyone else too. Like, it really depends on where you are. If you're in a riding where it's going to be, either, I don't know, the NDP or the Liberals, well then vote NDP. If you're in a riding that, say, the Greens are leading, say you're in BC somewhere, then ensure you vote Green. But it's even in a situation where, I mean, if you're in a riding, and there are ridings like this where it's solidly conservative or liberal, and there is no chance of an NDP victory or no chance of a Green victory, then I think you can argue that voting Liberal in that scenario does make sense. So I'm kind of the mind of strategic voting.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, yeah, I mean, I don't blame anybody for deciding to not vote Liberal and going with their heart and voting NDP, because again, we're looking at a system where we have multiple parties. And we have the potential here for a minority government. And if we have a minority government, you're going to want a strong left voice in that situation. And the hope is that there is the potential there for a coalition, potentially with the NDP and the Greens and the Liberals. So, yeah, it all depends on your riding. Me personally, I'm sort of leaning to the NDP.
David Doel, thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it. Everybody immediately go subscribe to the Rational National. It's great. I always enjoy David's perspective. And appreciate your time, man. Talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks. All right, guys. We'll be back live 20 minutes or so for the main show.